Hello chess lovers, welcome to our chess channel Chessmaster. Today we will learn about an isolated pawn with some examples. What is an isolated pawn? An isolated pawn is a pawn that has no friendly pawn on an adjacent file or neighbor file. If there is no pawn supporting our pawn on the neighbor file, the pawn will be called as isolated pawn or single pawn. Properties of an isolated pawn. Isolated pawns are usually a weakness because they cannot be protected by other pawns. The neighbor pawns will not be able to save the isolated pawn, that is why it is a weakness. Second, the square in front of the pawn may become a good outpost for the enemy piece. An isolated pawn is a weakness because if opponent outpost a piece in front of the square, so our pawn will be a weakness. Isolated pawns most become weaker in the end game as there are fewer pieces available to protect the pawn. Less pieces are available in the end game, that is why it is very difficult to save the isolated pawn, that is why it is generally a weakness in the end game. However, isolated pawns can provide improved development and some opportunities for counterplay. But in some cases, isolated pawns are good because it provides opportunity to start a counterplay. Weakness of an isolated pawn. In the end game, as we studied before, isolated pawns are a weakness because they cannot be defended by other pawns as with the connected pawns. There are two reasons that isolated pawns are weak. First, the pieces attacking them usually have more flexibility than those defending them. If white has an isolated pawn and black is generally attacking on the pawn, so there are no pawns to defend the weaker pawn, that is why a piece will defend the pawn. That is why the first reason is the pawn is saved by pieces itself. That is why it is an weakness. Second, the second reason is that the square immediately in front of the isolated pawn is weak since it is immune to attack by a pawn, often providing an excellent outpost for a knight, and the enemy piece located in the square cannot be attacked by rooks because the isolated pawn blocks the file it is on. Thus, an isolated pawn provides a typical example of what William Stiglitz called weak squares. Weak squares generally arises from the pawn structure. Isolated pawn, the square in front of the isolated pawn, is generally known as the weak square. Some examples are as follows. Look at the diagram. Here, white's pawn on the E file and black's pawn on the A file are isolated because the neighboring file D and F has no pawns to protect this E pawn, and there is no pawn on the B file to protect the A pawn. That is why it is an isolated pawn. Like H pawn is protected with the G pawn, that is why it is pawn chain, connected pawn chain, it is protected pawn chain. And as in the C and the D file, the pawns are connected, there are no isolated pawns. C and D are protected, G and H pawns are protected. Only A pawn from the black's point of view and E pawn from the white's point of view are weak pawns because it is an isolated pawn. If black attacks on the E pawn, we generally have to use a piece to defend them. That is why it is a weakness, and the square in front of the pawn, the E5 square, is generally the square in front of the e pawn is the e5 square, and it is good for black to put a knight on this square because it is an outpost, because it is an isolated pawn, and it is always good to put a knight in front of the isolated pawn. Okay, so that is a weakness. E pawn is a weakness and a pawn is a weakness. Some exception of this rule, an isolated pawn is not always a weakness. Why? Because sometimes it provides a good opportunity to attack or to start an counterplay. That is why. In some position, it protects some squares, central or flank squares, to restrict enemy pieces. In this diagram, D pawn is an isolated queen pawn because it is on the queen file, but the development of the pieces are better. That is why in this case this pawn is generally not a weakness. If somehow black able to attack on this pawn, so it will become a huge weakness if white is not able to defend successfully the d pawn. So thank you so much. Subscribe our channel Chessmaster. We will look a good chess video further. Thank you so much.